They lunged at the invisible circle Dmitri had drawn, frantically clawing at the barrier, as if trying to stop something even worse than themselves from arriving. The ghastly green light erupted in intensity, turning the night into a hellish day. The temperature dropped suddenly, a deep, unnatural cold that made the air seem to thicken and crystallize. And then, an absolute silence fell. The wind stopped. The spirit's screams went silent. All sound vanished. All that remained was a crushing pressure, an invisible weight pressing down from the sky, nearly forcing Elena to her knees. It had arrived. It had no form. It had no face. It was the absence of everything. A hole in reality. In the midst of that silence, Dmitri began to act. He threw the handful of black salt, creating a second circle within the first. The salt sizzled as it hit the snow, releasing a thin white smoke. He took the hawk feathers and began to move in a slow, ancient dance, his mouth muttering Mansi incantations, his voice the only sound in the silent universe. But the harvester didn't care about him. It only cared about Elena, and it began its final assault, not with force, but with temptation. A voice spoke in Elena's head, the very voice she had just used to call it. Professor Afanasiev's voice, Elena. The voice was no longer cold or mocking. It was warm, full of forgiveness and pride. You did it. You were brave enough to look beyond the textbooks. You came. You found me. Before Elena, in the now still blizzard, an image began to form. Professor Afanasiev, not as a distorted ghost, but as he had been in life, smiling kindly, his eyes twinkling with pride. All I ever wanted was to show you, the image said, its voice echoing in her mind. This is not evil, Elena. This is truth. A truth greater, more ancient than human science. I came to understand that, and now you can too. Dmitri was yelling something, his incantations growing more urgent, but his voice seemed to come from a great distance. Elena's entire world had shrunk to just her and the image of her teacher. Come, Elena, he said, holding out his hand. His hand looked so warm and real, she could almost feel its heat through the blizzard. Just one more step. Step out of that superstitious circle. Come to me. Let us face the truth together. I forgive you. I always forgave you. It was everything she had wanted to hear. Forgiveness, understanding, validation. The compass in her hand grew pleasantly warm. The whispers became a soothing lullaby. The 9 spirits were screaming in silence, their faces contorted in despair. Just one step. One step to gain the peace she had searched for her entire life. Her foot slowly lifted from the snow asterisk. It hung in the air for an endless moment, a single action that would decide her fate. Below, it was the invisible line of the circle, the boundary between life and something worse than death. Before her, the image of Professor Afanasiev smiled, his hand outstretched, a promise of peace, of forgiveness. The compass in her hand was as warm as a beating heart, and the lullaby in her head grew sweeter, more seductive. Just one more step, but just as the heel of her boot was about to come down outside the circle, something made her pause. A movement. At the edge of her vision, it was the 9 spirits. They were no longer clawing hopelessly at the barrier. They had stopped. They were all looking at her, and in their empty sockets, for the first time, Elena saw no hatred. She saw absolute desperation. Their silent mouths were moving, trying to form a single word. One of them, a woman with long frozen hair, reached her skeletal arm toward her, not to attack, but to plead. Tears of black ice streamed from her empty sockets, and in that moment, Elena understood. This was not liberation. This was recruitment. The peace the harvester promised was the eternal emptiness these 9 spirits were suffering. Its forgiveness was a cage. She would not be reunited with her teacher. She would become the 10th puppet. The truth hit her like a hammer blow. The pleasant warmth from the compass suddenly became a searing, venomous heat. The soothing lullaby in her head turned into a high-pitched, discordant shriek of tortured metal. The illusion shattered. Elena looked straight at the image of her teacher, and this time she saw through the facade. She saw the emptiness behind the pride-filled eyes. She saw the hideous hunger behind the kind smile. She snatched her foot back, planting it firmly inside the circle. "No," she whispered, a faint but defiant refusal. The image of Professor Afanasiev froze, his smile stiffening. Elena raised her head, strength returning to her veins, a strength born of the newly revealed truth. She looked directly into the illusion's eyes and screamed, her voice tearing through the ghostly silence, a cry of defiance and freedom. "You are not my teacher." In that instant, the world exploded. The image of Professor Afanasiev shattered like a broken mirror. The kind smile twisted, melting into a malicious sneer, revealing a black, empty void within. The outstretched hand cramped, turning into a claw of black ice. And then, a scream erupted. It did not come from the illusion. It did not come from the 9 spirits. It came from everywhere. From the sky, from the ground, from the very air. It was the scream of the mountain, a sound of primal fury, an explosion of pure, long-suppressed malice. The invisible pressure that had been weighing them down was suddenly released in a violent shockwave. The waves swept through, blasting snow and rock. The 9 spirits were blown away like dry leaves, vanishing into the storm. Dmitri was thrown backward, tumbling into the snow. His incantations cut short. Elena stood alone in the circle, the compass in her hand now as cold as death itself. The temptation was over. The real battle had just begun. The mountain scream still echoed in Elena's bones, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The blizzard was no longer a chaotic vortex. It had transformed. The wind and snow now swirled around their circle, forming a solid white wall, a natural arena. The ghastly green light no longer spread out. It coalesced, converging into a single point in the center of the vortex, directly above them. And in that point of convergence, a shadow began to take shape. It was not the shape of a man or a monster. It was the negation of shape. A hole in reality, a black, bottomless tear that swallowed light, swallowed space. Around the tear, the air froze into crystals of black ice, and an absolute cold. Cold of a dead universe radiated out, extinguishing all warmth. This was the silent harvester in its true form. No more whispers, no more illusions. Only a primal, endless hunger. Elena. Dmitri's call pulled her from her stupor. He had struggled to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. But his eyes burned with an unquenchable fire. He held the rope braided from hair in his hand. It is revealed. It can't hide anymore. Now, use the compass. Don't let it escape. Elena looked down at the silver object in her hand. It was no longer cold. It was vibrating intensely, as if resonating with the entity above. She understood. This wasn't a battle of destruction. It was a sealing ritual. She raised the compass high, aiming it directly at the black tear. "I know you're here," She shouted, her voice no longer trembling, but filled with a power she never knew she possessed. "I am not afraid of you anymore." As if in reply, a wave of black energy shot from the tear, hitting her. It was not a physical force. It was a wave of pure despair. Every failure, every pain, every regret in her life suddenly returned, magnified. 1,000 times, threatening to drown her in a sea of self-loathing. She staggered, her knees nearly buckling. But she did not fall. The image of the 9 pleading spirits, the image of Dmitri fighting for her, gave her an anchor. No. She roared, focusing all her will into the compass. "You cannot have me." The compass in her hand blazed, emitting a brilliant silver aura. A chain of silver light shot out from it, flying toward the black tear and wrapping around it. The entity roared, a silent sound that shook the entire mountain. It struggled, trying to break free from the chain of light. The blizzard around them howled more fiercely, sharp shards of ice flying everywhere. "Hold it, Elena," Dmitri shouted, beginning to move. He didn't circle, but walked straight toward her, his mouth still muttering Mansi incantations. The rope of hair in his hand began to glow, a warm, amber light. He came to stand before her, facing the entity's wrath. He did not flinch. He raised the rope. "By the blood of my ancestors, by the hair of my mothers, I command you." He roared. "Return to the silence." He threw the rope toward the compass. The rope didn't fall. It flew up, wrapping around the silver aura, weaving itself into the chain of light, reinforcing it with a power of life, of heritage. The chain grew stronger, tightening around the black tear. Pulling it down, the entity shrieked in desperation, struggling wildly. The entire mountain shook. Avalanches began to fall from the surrounding slopes, creating a deafening roar. "Pull, Elena. Pull it into the compass," Dmitri yelled, placing his hands on her shoulders to lend her strength. Elena put all her remaining strength, both physical and mental, into pulling. She felt as if she were pulling an entire universe. Her muscles screamed, her mind felt like it would burst. The black tear was slowly dragged down, shrinking, being sucked into the shining surface of the compass, and then, with one final pop, it vanished completely. Everything stopped. The roar of the avalanches died down. The blizzard instantly dissipated. The ghastly green light was gone, replaced by a pale gray on the horizon. They stood there, panting in the sudden silence. Elena looked down at the compass in her hand. It no longer glowed. Consciousness returned to Elena, not as an awakening, but as a slow, painful ascent from a black abyss. The first sound she heard was the static of a radio, but this time, it was real. The first smell was hot coffee and antiseptic. The first sensation was the rough warmth of a wool blanket. She was in a rescue tent, the dim yellow light of a hurricane lamp hanging from the ceiling. A man in uniform was talking to her, but his words seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by a thick layer of cotton in her ears. Severe hypothermia. Oxygen-deprived hallucinations. "You remember what happened, Miss Petrova?" She remembered. God, she remembered everything. But how could she explain it? How could she tell this man with his logical face about faces with no eyes, about an entity woven from darkness, about a sealing ritual with blood and hair? She just shook her head, and they accepted it. The official report would read as a classic mountaineering accident. 2 inexperienced climbers trapped in an unusual storm, suffering from the effects of altitude and stress. Everything could be explained away neatly. They never found the compass. When Elena was fully conscious and asked about it, the rescuers just looked at her with confusion. No compass was found in her belongings or at the site. It had vanished. The journey back was a blur. Hospitals, questions, strange faces. She and Dmitri were separated. The last she saw of him was as he was being loaded into a different ambulance. He didn't look at her. He just stared toward the distant mountains, his face an emotionless mask, but his eyes held an ancient weariness, as if he had lived 1,000 years in just the last 2 days. Months passed. Elena tried to return to a normal life, but normal had become a foreign concept. She had survived, but a part of her had died on that mountain. Her scientific worldview was shattered, and nothing could piece it back together. She could no longer look at an equation without thinking of symbols drawn in blood. She could no longer look into the darkness without wondering what was looking back. She could never sleep soundly again. Every time she closed her eyes, the images of the empty sockets appeared. And sometimes, in the silence of the late night, she felt she could hear a faint, distant whisper, mixed in with the wind, and she began to see things. Shadows at the edge of her vision seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of a distorted face in her reflection on a subway window. She had been marked. Her eyes had been opened, and she could never close them again. One autumn afternoon, when the sky was the color of ash, she received a package. It was wrapped in old brown paper, the return address listed as the university archives. It was Professor Avanasiev's effects finally being returned. Her heart pounded as she used a letter opener to slice it open. Inside were familiar things. A few densely notated notebooks, an old tobacco pipe, a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. She lifted them out carefully, feeling like an archaeologist excavating a tomb, and then, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of black velvet, was Ida's silver compass, classic in design, its casing intricately engraved. It was identical to the one on the mountain, completely intact. Impossible. Elena took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. This must have been his personal compass, the one he always carried. The one on the mountain. It must have been a ghostly coincidence, a hallucination, right? Her hand, trembling, slowly reached out. She had to be sure. She picked it up. It wasn't cold. It was room temperature. Its silver needle was still pointing perfectly north. There was no black dot. A dizzying wave of relief washed over her. Just a coincidence. Just her mind playing tricks on her. She smiled. A shaky, weak smile. She placed the compass on her desk and turned away to make a cup of tea, trying to slow her heart rate, and then she heard Ida very soft tick-tocks froze tick. Tock. The sound wasn't coming from the wall clock. It was coming from behind her. From the desk. Slowly, like an automaton, she turned back around. She looked at the compass. The silver needle, which had been still, was now slowly turning. It made one full rotation, then stopped. It was no longer pointing north, it was pointing directly at her, and as she stared at it in horror, a tiny black dot, as small as the head of a pin, began to appear at the center of the glass, slowly spreading like a drop of ink in water. The ticking continued, steady and unstoppable. The only sound in the silent room. The harvester hadn't been sealed away. It had simply changed prisons, and now it had a new warden.